Hello and welcome. I'm Eric Nentrup with the EdSafe Artificial Intelligence Alliance. A core piece of the Alliance's work centers around the SAFE Benchmarks framework, and today we are focusing on the topic of accountability as it applies to AI in ed tech. This has implications across all constituent groups in our field and can even impact both classroom teachers and students. Today, I'm joined by Kelly Shiohira from JET Education Services and Beth Havinga, the Alliance's Managing Director. Welcome, Kelly and Beth. Tell me, if you will, what brought you to working with the Alliance, and let's start with Beth.
Thanks, Eric. For me, I've seen the digital education segment as a really rich ecosystem of innovation, but it consists of so many different moving parts and pieces. And for the past almost decade, I've been looking at the development of standards with regard to how those pieces work together. So predominantly interoperability. Looking at the newer technologies that we're dealing with, though, like AI, it is of increased importance that we manage to bring those pieces together in ways that understand each other, in ways that are safe, and in ways that protect education moving forwards. And understanding that globally, we haven't really had any access to benchmarks or standards for AI specifically within education, the Alliance automatically got my attention. I think it's something that's so exciting to work on. How about you, Kelly?
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Eric. Thank you very much for having me today. At JET Education Services, we are an NGO located in South Africa. So we focus primarily on Africa, the continent, but do about 20% of our work internationally as well. And as a development organization, we're very focused on the improvement of education and furthering the connections between education and the world of work. We got into the AI space a few years ago, actually, working also through the principles of interoperability, depth, and data sovereignty, as some of our projects are beginning to increasingly deal with the influx and flow of data between institutions and departments, and using this data to drive decision-making. So the EdSafe Alliance was immediately appealing to us because obviously the principles that are espoused in the mission statement of the EdSafe Alliance really align to the work that we're doing and the hope that we have for AI in developing contexts.
Kelly, I love that answer. And we're going to get into talking about compliance, governance, data interoperability a little bit more here in a second. But before I do, I just have to ask a selfish question. As a former classroom teacher and administrator myself, I want to know how each of you, your practice has impacted you in the present and given you kind of a footing for the perspectives that you've been cultivating around this particular topic of accountability applied to AI and ed tech. Just a brief statement so we all understand kind of where each of us have come from in our own practice, whether it was in the classroom or as an academic. And back to you, Beth. We'll start there. Tell us a little bit about your education career, just in a nutshell.
My nutshell is multifaceted. So I started out as a high school teacher, but I have moved through curriculum writing, software sales, publisher management, so education publisher management. For the past almost decade, I've been working more in policy, so doing a lot of work together with multiple ministries of education, designing different standards frameworks. I've represented multiple countries at international levels, then on the development of technical standards, interoperability standards, but then I have worked a lot more closely on the development of regulatory documents and policy in the past sort of 3 to 5 years.
Very good. And Kelly, how about the span of your education career?
So probably a little bit different, but starting out quite similarly. Believe it or not, my first career was actually as a horse trainer. So I just started off teaching people how to ride horses. And then I segued into actually being a classroom teacher, and I did that for about 5 years. Also worked in curriculum development and extracurricular augmentation and things like that, writing programs. And then I went back for further education, studied international development and linguistics, actually. So started developing ICT programs for education, particularly in minority languages in South Africa. So Tshivenda, Xitsonga, Sepedi, these languages that maybe we don't hear that much about. So that was kind of my segue into the world of ICT and education. And it was almost a natural evolution into AI. So I work quite a lot now with international organizations, the African Continental Qualifications Frameworks, the ILO, UNICEF, UNESCO, and assisting them in their desktop and groundwork in terms of implementing these types of programs. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I think as well, that's one thing that Kelly and I share. So we're both linguists. We both studied linguistics, but then I went more from the idea of equity. So looking at how multilingual children were able to access their education when the languages aren't supported in the school environment within which they're learning. So another nice sort of tangent there.
Fantastic.
Well, I'm glad we took that little quick background detour, because I think equity plays a part in each of our backgrounds that bring us to the present, where, you know, we're getting some insight into different quadrants that impact the profession at large. And I think when it comes to equity and we think about accountability, that there is a lot hanging in the balance if we don't get this right. And there are lessons learned from prior eras in which we've operated using education technology in a variety of ways, whether it's administrative or curricular or anywhere in between. And I think that's a pretty good, pivot point for us to talk about, like, what is at risk with that proper accountability. And I just want to kind of give the floor to you guys to talk about this, and we'll see where the conversation goes. So, there is definitely something hanging in the balance if we don't get this right. I don't think that's too presumptive to state, is it?
No, I think in general, for me, accountability is about taking true leadership within this entire framework of implementing any kind of technology, but specifically AI. So it's about being able to protect, enable, and provide sort of areas of recourse to the users of AI within education.
Absolutely. Kelly, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I would just maybe add that for me, accountability is the main mechanism that underpins all of the other letters. Accountability is what will ensure that we are safe, that we are fair, that we are efficient, that we are inclusive. It's a very multifaceted idea, and there's a lot to unpack within accountability, but I definitely agree with Beth that it is absolutely critical that we get the accountability structures and systems and principles in place in order to make the optimal use of AI in education.
Yeah, and I think if you look at sort of the last 2 years, we're coming out of an area which was slightly less regulated than normal because of the pandemic, which was exciting on the one hand. It was a little bit of the Wild West with some of the ed tech things that were being implemented. And it meant that things could move fast. There was really interesting innovation. But on the flip side, we're coming out into a time where now everything's being looked at with such scrutiny that we haven't seen before. And with the ability to sort of compare also internationally, because everyone was going through such a big change at the same time. And we're seeing globally a lot of the different regulatory bodies as a knee-jerk reaction trying to overextend certain regulations, make it fit in ways that maybe don't reflect the ways that they or the practice that's happening within schools. And I think we're in a time where we need to be able to start defining these areas of accountability quickly. We need to be able to address who is responsible for what, who is the person to go to if something breaks, what happens when things are stolen, if there is a data breach, what can we do to make sure that doesn't happen again, and things like that. And so I think we're in a really, really interesting time specifically for this topic, coming out of a massive flux under a lot of scrutiny, but with no real systems in place at this moment, especially at a global level, against which we can really measure the accountability.
As one of the people doing that intense scrutiny, I guess I'll come in from that side. I think that you're absolutely right to say that the structures aren't in place and we don't have the definitions fleshed out as fully as we should. I think that one of the things we need to think about is who's actually driving that conversation, though, and where are the interests that lie in terms of these definitions. And I think just to go a little bit towards the micro level, as we would say, one of the examples I would point out is that we recently completed work with UNESCO on mapping AI K-12 curricula. And one of the things, we didn't focus on a comparison of different types of curricula in that paper, but one of the things that very clearly came out was that curricula that were largely industry driven left out quite a lot of content, and they focused on particularly the ethics of artificial intelligence in a very specific way. So I think we can all agree that we are in a space now where almost everyone interacts with AI. somehow in some ways, whether it's recommender algorithms or, predictor algorithms or whatever it might be. And these are going to influence people's college opportunities, bank loan decisions, and so on and so forth. So everyone should have a basic understanding of the pros and the cons. But what you find in industry-driven curricula is that actually they focus overwhelmingly on the pros. So how can AI reach disenfranchised populations? And they also tend to focus heavily on things like intellectual property rights and preventing cybercrime, which are important. But the concerns of the everyday citizen are largely probably around access, bias, redress, equity, human agency, transparency, and these you won't see feature. So I think as we move into this new regulatory environment, there's a need to balance the innovation side, which definitely will be stifled by too much regulation, with the rights of citizens and the needs of citizens. And frankly, understand that education is not industry driven only. Work is one part of education, but there's also a responsibility to create citizens, who are socially active and politically responsible and economically active as the third part of that triad, if I could put it there.
Oh, absolutely, you can. I think that there's a sense of urgency around figuring this out for that very reason, that we in education are, sort of acclimated to the fact that we're planting seeds with every child that we have on our rosters as classroom teachers. And may not be fundamentally aware of that gap in the systems that you're talking about, what those implications might be as it applies to graduating our students into citizens in our communities. What sort of systems adjustments need to be made? And if we span quite a dynamic range of discussing what this looks like, I'm completely happy with that. And Beth, we'll just kick it back to you to start. But what is missing in our current systems from your own experience in Europe and what you've witnessed globally in other countries, comparing different governance models and having different conversations around similar topics, but as it applies to this particular one of accountability with AI and ed tech? What do we need that we don't have right now?
In just about every country that I'm active in at the moment, I'm hearing the same thing. And it's the fact that there is a complete lack of transparency in terms of who people can talk to if something goes wrong, what their legal rights are sometimes if something goes wrong, who carries the liability specifically in terms of teachers and those doing the purchasing if something breaks, if the tool isn't safe. There's the responsibility sits at so many different levels. So there's that smaller level of the implementer. There's the level of responsibility in terms of the developers. There's actually also a lack of transparency from many governments and ministries in terms of what is actually allowed or why certain things are not allowed or what they can do to redress changes. There's also then the higher level of sort of how do we accept that mistakes are going to happen? How can we make sure that the information that comes out of those mistakes can be passed on and we can continue to learn from them? So, for example, in other industries, there are systems in place to learn from massive failures. So in civil engineering, there's conferences that happen sort of around the world where they look at why a bridge broke so that no one builds that same bridge again. In medicine, we have things like the M&M conferences where we look and see why patients died and see what we can do to make sure that we could maybe not be there again. In education, we're missing some of these structures as well that could enable us to look at massive data breaches or massive sort of breaks in systems to see how can we learn from them, what needs to change as an industry, as a policy collective as well, to ensure that the safety is continuing. I think in education, oftentimes because of the sensitivity of the data and because of the political nature of the entire topic as well, some of these things aren't addressed as transparently or as openly as I would hope. But for me, it's at all levels. There's a real lack of transparency for everybody to understand what they can do, who they should be talking to about it, and what happens if something goes wrong.
Very well said. Kelly, do you agree with Beth that we basically need in our field a Hippocratic oath as it applies to this topic?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting way to put it, and probably a fair way to put it. But on the other hand, Can you anticipate the outcomes of using an AI product before you've actually done it? So this is where I think the point of avenues of redress come in. So I think we do need to accept that this is an innovative space. It's a learning space. Mistakes are going to be made. That should be declared up front. And then we need to also then, though, think about compensation or, we talk about the Better Business Bureau in America. Like, what do you do with a company that isn't doing that? And there's also issues of data ownership, frankly. I would just like to touch on those a little bit. I heard someone recently at a conference, I'm sorry, I can't quote who it was because I've forgotten, but pointed out that if companies paid for the data that they use to create their algorithms, we would eradicate third world poverty overnight, and maybe that's true. I don't know. I think it's worth a little bit more exploration. I think it would certainly stifle who can get into the field and who can start to innovate. And so these things always need to be balanced. But at the same time, we protect ourselves. We protect our data, we protect our privacy, or we try to. And at JET, we're big proponents of self-sovereign identity and the principle of self-sovereign identity, and that each individual should be able to control how their data works. In the education space, actually, we run into some serious opposition to this because the easiest example is higher education institutions. If I want to access my credential from UPenn, for example, I have to pay them to get it. So they own my credential. So we advocate for a shift in that system so that actually the person who paid for and earned the credential would own it in perpetuity and be able to access it in a verifiable manner through, blockchain and other things like this. And your education system is not happy to think about it this way. They're happy to think about industry not taking their data, but they're less happy to think about how they are making use of students' data routinely. And even, recently I ran into this with my own children in Florida. They implemented the FAST testing system. So great idea, it's just kind of a rapid evaluation against curriculum standards. And on paper, it all sounds really good. But being who I am, I wanted to dig into okay, but where does this data go? Who stores it? Who has access to it? How else is it going to be used? There's a complete lack of transparency. No one seems to know that. They were able to describe to me in detail how I could access my child's data on a portal, but that wasn't really what I was after. And finally, they, admitted they don't actually know, and then they offered me a job. So,
as well they should. As well they should. Oh my goodness.
I like JET though. I'm happy where I am.
We all do. Yes. Oh my gosh. Too great. Well, hey, Kelly, you gave a 30,000-foot level applied locally to your own children as students. Beth, as we're close on time here, do you have an example that you'd like to end with in terms of just how you see us getting this right translates to delivering on the promise of AI in ed tech as a mother, as a former classroom teacher, in your current role as the multi-ministries of education guru in the Council of Europe?
So for me, I think anything we can do to make access to education easier, safer, more practical is something brilliant. And I think that's what's riding on the discussions we're having here around accountability. And for me, that can start at the really low level. So having even just a printout that you can hand out to parents and things about sort of the information that's going places, it comes down to the accountability of the industry. Are they providing transparent access to what's happening with the data flows, with the systems, how you're getting data in and out of the systems they're using? It goes back to the data protection officers and agencies. Are they providing transparent guidelines for, the recommended data flows for reasons why things are being approved or denied? Are they adhering in a uniform manner to data protection regulations, which, spoiler alert, isn't happening around the world the way it should. And then it goes all the way up the chain. I think there's something that can be done at every single level to start right now to help increase that transparency and be able to then implement, even in small measure, things that allow people to feel safe and empowered in their use of the technology. And that's what it has to be about, because we're not going to get around using this technology. Looking at sort of the lack of teachers we have globally, looking at some of the amazing initiatives we have, the fact that we're looking at periods of unrest because of climate, because of war, because of anything that's happening, we are going to need to rely on these technologies. And so we need to find ways that are safe and practicable to use them and implement them and empower the users.
I think that's a fantastic way to wrap up the fact that we're just barely scratching the surface in today's conversation. But I hope it does for the audience elucidate the fact that there are an awful lot of contributing strands to this conversation, and that most everyone has a role in which they can operate to become better educated, to advocate for their own children, let alone for industry accountability. And we can all contribute in our own local, state, national, and global demand for rising to the occasion, and seeing that AI does deliver on its promise in ed tech to cover issues such as equity and workforce shortages and all the other challenges that we are trying to collectively overcome. And the best way to do that is together, and that's why the Alliance exists. So Beth and Kelly, I want to thank you both for taking time today out of your busy schedules, and thank you for also advocating in your own roles as you do. Our children and our teachers definitely stand to benefit from that, and so I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. And to wrap things up here, in upcoming episodes, we're going to shift our focus to the implications of both fairness and efficacy components of the framework, and hear from other teammates and engaged members of the Alliance for how this work impacts educators and the students they teach, as well as ed tech developers and policymakers. Thanks so much for joining, and we will see you again soon.